Well, welcome everybody this evening. We're really happy to be hosting this Zoom call specifically about traveling with our gender-expansive choristers this summer. I have to give a shout out to Troy Meeker in Phoenix because he was kind of the instigator of this question, and it generated a lot of discussion on our Facebook page. So that's how we came to wanting to do this Zoom call. Just again, a reminder, this is being recorded and we will be making it available to our membership. If you have questions, you can just put them in the chat. We have a small group of people right now, so I think we may be able to just have a conversation with all of us. If you do have specific questions or if they come up, might be best to just put them in the chat and then we'll address them as they come up. Our panelists are Andrea Langkamer-Smith, who is a parent of a current chorister and an alumni chorister of mine at the Bel Canto Youth Chorus. Her now young adult Sorrel began transitioning while they were in Bel Canto, and they're now a sophomore in college. We traveled with Sorrel and Andrea to England in 2019, which was a really terrific learning experience for all of us. Dr. Josh Palkki is Associate Professor of Music Education at Cal State Long Beach, researching managing gender expansiveness in choirs. He connected with me regarding some specific research he's doing with boy choirs, and so that's how I came to know Josh. Melanie Stapleton is the author of Blurring the Binary, a website and blog specifically focused on teaching transgender students in the music classroom, and a well-known LGBTQ advocate. She taught for 7 years in Texas public schools and is currently a PhD student in music ed at Northwestern University. And I'm Joy Hirokawa. I'm the founder and artistic director of the Bel Canto Youth Chorus of the Bach Choir of Bethlehem and the ACDA National Chair for Children and Community Youth Choirs. So I'd like to just start with sharing a little bit of my experience briefly with Andrea Sorrel and her family as Sorrel came out while they were in choir and eventually started transitioning while in choir, and how that experience impacted my chorus in a very positive way, I felt. I was, of course, very honored to be part of the process, to be included in part of the process and trusted as to being part of the process. And I give Andrea a huge amount of credit for that. It was really an honor to be included in seeing this young person emerge from kind of a dark place and into a flourishing and amazing leader, like probably one of the best leaders I had in my choir in the time that they were there. It was astonishing to me to see the transformation. And I think really positive for the rest of the choristers as well. Just seeing the transformation of an individual, seeing them coming into themselves, and a lesson in acceptance of who people are and of who, and I think that had a really positive effect on the rest of the choir and their attitudes. So it was really a great learning experience for us. And we also traveled. In 2019, we traveled to England, and 3 years ago was different than 4 years ago now, I guess, is different than 2023. We did a lot of anticipating and thinking ahead, but there were also some challenges and things that we faced as we were traveling. So I'm going to pass it over to Andrea, and maybe you can share a little bit about your experience from the parents' point of view.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you so much. I do just want to say, first of all, thank you, Joy, for organizing this. I can't say enough about how incredible you have been, how open-minded and welcoming, and that has made all the difference. And I think that has absolutely set the tone for the choristers. So seeing how accepting Joy, or as they say, Dr. H, has been, it's made it just so much easier for everybody, for all of the choristers. So I think this is a tremendous forum that anybody who is watching this is going to learn. And I think that's how we can affect change, just by showing who we are and who our kids are, and just showing that everybody's welcome. And definitely Joy has set the example for that. So I am extremely grateful So my child is transgender, identifying as non-binary. And Sorrel had sung with the bel canto choir, I think for just 1 year, maybe, when they started that transition. And there was a lot of anxiety, I think, over starting to tell people in the choir to have that conversation with Joy. And I think the first thing that Sorrel was concerned about, I remember coming home from a performance that had been just magnificent, and the choir sang so beautifully. And I said, this was just so thrilling to be a part of that. And Sorrel just looked completely dejected and sad and said, I feel horrible in the concert uniform because it doesn't fit who I am, and I just feel so sad. And that was when I knew this was something so wonderful, and that we had to do whatever we could do to ensure that Sorrel could stay a part of the choir, but being in the female uniform was not working. And so the first thing in talking with Joy, I think Sorrel was a little nervous, but everybody wears the same uniform, and what if it's not okay for me not to wear it? And so that was kind of the first hurdle. And seeing Joy's amazing reaction of just, well, what would you like to wear? What would you be comfortable in? And how can we make that work? And just being so open-minded, that really set the tone for everything. And so the uniform was, maybe that seems like an easy thing, but that was a big hurdle. And I think that set everything else into motion in a really, really positive way, that we knew going forward it was going to be a great experience within this choir. So it was a bit of a tough decision. Well, to go on the trip to England, I will say was maybe a little bit of a hard decision, because there had been 2 previous years that Sorrel did not travel with the choir because they weren't mentally healthy at that time, and going through the transition process was really really difficult, and it was a really stressful time. So Sorrel wasn't mentally well to travel away from family. And so going on the England trip, and I was going as a chaperone, so it was a really good situation. But I think one of the biggest concerns, first we had the question of rooming, and where do you put a non-binary kid in a room with somebody else? And again, Joy, the leadership of this group, was so open and willing to talk, and just willing to say what is going to work best for you. And so my biggest feeling on rooming assignments is you cannot possibly have a one-size-fits-all hard and fast rule or policy. And we had seen that as our family in a previous situation where Sorrel had been attending a summer camp program for many years. And when they made that transition, Sorrel said, I don't feel comfortable going into a sleeping situation, sharing cabins in the girls' cabin. I'm not comfortable with that, but equally not comfortable going into a boys' cabin. And unfortunately, the camp had no solutions for us. And so the only solution was for my child not to be allowed to attend camp. And that was really, really heartbreaking. And I think just when you have those hard and fast rules, like, people with female anatomy have to room together and people with male anatomy have to room together, it just doesn't work for everybody. And so, I think the biggest thing that we learned as a family is you just have to work with this on a case-by-case basis as individuals, and just having those conversations and saying, what would you be comfortable with? And that was how Joy approached the trip to England. And so Sorrel ultimately decided that they would like to room with me since I was a chaperone. But I think, just talking it out with everybody and not having strict rules about who has to share a room with whom is what I would like to see happen. So the bathroom situation was always a tough one. And I remember we took an overnight flight over to England, and you don't sleep very much on those flights. And we got off the plane and got right onto a bus and went to Windsor and had a tour of Windsor Castle. And it was wonderful, but we were tired, and everybody had to use the restroom. And so, especially I think in another country, you're not really familiar maybe with what their situations are. And we found a male restroom and we found a female restroom, and Sorrel didn't know what to do. And then we saw there was a single stall individual restroom. It was labeled as the handicap restroom, and Sorrel was waiting in line for that. And an older woman who was having trouble walking. Oh, I should say the male and female restrooms were down a flight of steps, and the handicap one was up on the street level. And so Sorrel came back to me in tears and said that an older woman had started yelling at them and saying, "You need to walk down the stairs and go use the restroom downstairs. This is only for people who have mobility issues." And it was just really awful. It was a terrible way to start the trip, really, to have that feeling. Sorrel just said, "Well, where am I supposed to go? There's nowhere for me." And again, Joy was just wonderful at saying, take the time that you need, because at this point we had a whole bus of kids waiting for us. We were waiting to go, and there was a line of several people to use this single stall restroom. And Joy just said, take the time you need, make sure you use the bathroom, use the appropriate one for you. And things got a lot better after that. So it was kind of an early hiccup in the trip, but I had another chaperone on the trip who was constantly, everywhere that we went, helping me to scout out where can we find a all gender restroom before we even need to worry about that. And so that was wonderful that I had another person always looking for a restroom for me. I think it's such an evolving time right now, and it's so exciting to see how many people are just thinking about the whole issue of gender in new ways. And I just think it's an exciting time because there's more openness and more accommodation for more acceptance of everybody. And I think it's changed a lot, even in 3 years, 4 years now since we did that trip. And hopefully we're going to see more changes in the next few years. I know that everywhere that I go, we're seeing all gender restrooms now. And so I think it's just much more prevalent, and there's a lot more acceptance. And I think that's really wonderful. And I think it's conversations like this that are really helping that change to happen. So, but I think just with Joy setting the tone of the choir, everybody was accepting of Sorrel in that group. And that's what you need. I think you need to start with somebody to set that example, and then other people will follow with that attitude too. So I think that's all that I wanted to say. I don't know if you had any questions for me or anything else that you wanted me to bring up.
No, I think that's terrific. Thank you so much. I remember that incident specifically that you referenced, and I remember Sorrel was just so upset, and I just felt so bad. I just felt so bad. I was like, what do you do? And then I thought, oh my goodness, is this the way it's going to be the whole time we're here? And so yeah, everybody was like, where is there a gender inclusive bathroom? Because
Right.
you just don't know. I'm going to go next to Josh. If you could talk a little bit about some of the research you've been doing and some of the things that you've been finding when it comes to gender inclusive practices with children and youth choirs and boy choirs.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Joy, for organizing this, and thank you, Andrea, for being here. I think it's such an important perspective, and I'm really glad that we started with some concrete examples of like how this can look, right? So in terms of research, I mean, a lot of the work that I've done is more centered in public schools. But I'm currently writing a paper looking at how American boy choirs are navigating issues of gender diversity, and what are American boy choirs doing in terms of, are they accepting people of all genders, and if so, are they renaming themselves and all of that. I do think one thing I want to highlight that I have written about a lot is the importance of two things. The first thing is one thing you just saw modeled for you, which is an individualized approach for that specific singer, that specific child. And the other thing is the importance of policy language, right? And so there's a lot of things that community choirs, that all choirs, but especially community choirs, can do in terms of like, what's in your handbook in terms of acceptance of gender diversity, and what does that actually look like in practice, right? I think that our tour companies need to be doing a lot more work on this. I think that, tour companies in 2023 absolutely need to be able to tell you if there's an all-gender restroom at a venue, at a cathedral, at a church, at a museum, right? I mean, we pay them a lot of money, and if we want to be inclusive, they can definitely do their part, right? If you're using a tour company. But generally, I think what I see is kind of two paths that our people in our profession seem to be taking on this issue. One is, what Joy just modeled for you, which is like, okay, let's ask questions, like, let's evolve, let's change, let's ask the child what they need. And you're seeing a lot of organizations and a lot of teachers sort of change their practices and change their thinking, right? As ideas about gender continue to change. And then you have people that are really sort of digging in their heels and are like, no, absolutely not. This is tradition. This is the way it's always been done. This is the way it always will be. And so you see this big divide start to happen, right? And you see it happening in print. It happens in articles. It happens in books, right? And then it happens in practice too. So I do think that this is such an important dialogue to be having, and I'm excited to be part of it. So thanks for having me.
Great. Melanie, maybe you could tell us a little bit some practical suggestions, bring in some of your information from your column on blurring the binary, or the blog post that you have, and specific suggestions of some of the things that we've been talking about, application, and how do we do this, and how do we manage?
Yeah, first off, I should say it's good to be here. This is something that's been an issue. It's been something that has been going on for a really long time. I talk a lot, and I've talked about my experience in my undergrad, where the choir director that year of my junior year was a new installation. The previous choir director had left after 27 years. And my junior year was when I started living and presenting as female full time, because as a trans woman, it's something that it's marked in my life of like a very specific date, a very specific time, when this happened for me, and when I felt comfortable. And my junior year was kind of prompted on this sentence of like, I wanted to finish transitioning, quote unquote, before I graduated. And my friend finally said, Melanie, like, get it together. And so my junior year, I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And I got a choir dress, and there were a lot of issues along the way of like performing and standing in sections and things that I address on my website. But for choir tour itself, in particular, it was like a very big thing every year in the spring. We would go and sing for high schools, and because I went to LSU in Louisiana, it was close to my home state of Texas, and we would usually go to the Houston and Dallas areas, and I'm from the Dallas area. And this year we are actually going to my high school. We are going to the place that I'd grown up, and where I evolved as a musician. And actually the concert was at the church where like we did all of our school performances, and I sang my first solo on that stage. It was a very special place in my heart musically, and also like for who I am as a person, even if I didn't always like the songs I was singing. But then my choir director, before we left for tour, pulled me to the side. He asked me to stay after a rehearsal, and he said, I want to talk to you in my office. So we go to his office, And he said, you know, I know that we're going to your high school on the tour, but you know, I want you to kind of fade into the background because people are going to find you disgusting. And he used that terminology, disgusting. And it was something that for me made me not ever like, I instantly was like, I don't want to be in this man's choir anymore. So that was how the trip started. And then the rest of the time it was like, well, you were assigned male at birth. You're going to be rooming with the guys. And that was sort of like how it was decided. There was no anything else. But it was interesting because like, I was wearing a choir dress. So like when I changed with the girls, but I roomed with the guys. And it was a very weird dichotomy. And this was back in 2013. The next year I student taught, and I actually took, I got out of my student teaching gig, I got a free trip to New York. And I got to kind of experience it from the director lens, but as a student teacher. But I remember like running into things that I didn't anticipate. Like when I got to the airport and I went to security, my legal name was different than what it said originally. My gender marker was not female. The kids knew me as Melanie Stapleton, but like my dead name was still on my driver's license. My gender marker was still on my driver's license, and it was incorrect. And I remember being terrified when we got to the airport because like my cooperating teacher knew, and he was a gay man and was very supportive of me, but you know, everything, it was like, all right, I got my boarding pass, and I gave it to the person, I made it through, and then I like tucked it away into my backpack because I didn't want to be outed, whether or not they knew. And I'm sure some people suspected and some people didn't, but it was like I didn't want any confirmation. I had like the same kind of bathroom struggle to Sorrel where it was like, okay, well, I'm going to use the women's restroom, but like if I didn't feel comfortable, because like large bathrooms are dangerous places for trans people, even small bathrooms, but there are safety elements that can be concerning, you know, so it's like, is there a gender neutral option just in case? That was something I had to consider. I remember actually when we went to go see the Statue of Liberty, we had a security checkpoint that we had to go to, and we had to I had to pull out my driver's license, and I had a whole thing with the security guard where they were like, what's happening, you know, like what is going on? And I just kind of was like, everything's good. And the trip went without a hitch. But there were a lot of little things along the way. And so in my website and in my research and in this blog post that I did for Course Connection, I've talked about rooming and trips and giving advice to directors who are kind of struggling with this issue, or maybe have never even thought about this issue whatsoever. And then what ends up happening is these people have never thought about the issue, and then they're kind of like, oh crap, what do I do? And so that's sort of like the way that I approach this and how to think about it. And so in my blog post, I actually give specific steps, which I pulled up just to have. But the very first step that I always say is like, first you have to think about the age group of your ensemble, right? Because an ensemble that is entirely kids is going to be able to navigate things entirely different than an ensemble of adults, right? Especially with community ensembles. So I feel like with kids, there's a lot more sticky situation, as because you have potentially unsupportive parents, you have potentially legal issues that of like one parent being supportive, one parent not being supportive. There are other things that are a little iffy. And you know, there's not really a right answer per se in that regard, but it's something that you need to be mindful of in terms of the age that you do. If you're working all with adults, then it's going to be a lot easier to an extent, because adults are adults and they can adult. Second, I always talk about having a set plan for rooming and paying for rooms. So as a choir teacher at a school, A lot of times, if we were going to travel somewhere, like you have to think about who is going to be rooming with who. And then you run into the issue, of course, that Andrea was just talking about, where it's like, well, where do I go? Where, if I'm not feeling comfortable with certain people, like what's the right way to go? Um, and I always say, like, if you're paying like as a choir, it's always best to like have everything go through you and you can kind of be the mediator. um you know and again, this goes back to the age question, right? Like if it's like a school group and you have kids that are there, you're going to have to get parent permission. But then you can't, like, and if it's in an educational setting, you have FERPA that you have to worry about, where it's like you can't disclose certain personal information about a student because the law. So like you can't say like, oh, this person's trans, can they room with you? Because that could be an issue. And also there's like moral implications of outing somebody, right? But yeah, so you get into some of those sticky situations, and what I typically recommend is it's going to vary from person to person as to what works. So like what works for one trans person, what works for one non-binary person might work for them, but it might not work for the next, because we're all different. And we all have kind of different experiences with the world and different comfort levels. So like, of course, the easiest option is like, hey, if you were assigned male at birth, you can room with somebody who's assigned male at birth as well. But like, that's not comfortable for most trans or non-binary people. It's just not. So like that might work, but like I wouldn't make that my only option. And I would say, are you comfortable with this? And if that kid is, great. You don't have to do anything else. They can choose, like, and I would give them first dibs as to who they room with, because again, safety issues. And just be like, okay, tell me who you want to room with. I'll make sure it happens so you feel comfortable. If that doesn't work, I always say room based on gender. Like that really should be the primary thing. It's like if somebody identifies as a woman, like that's who they are, and let them room with other women, period. Um, if they are non-binary, that's where I kind of give the option of like, hey, what do you feel comfortable with? Would you feel comfortable rooming with who would you feel comfortable with? And if they don't feel comfortable with either, it's like, okay, well, can we make maybe a private room work, or maybe like have a parent come and be a chaperone and then stay with your parent? Not always the best idea, but like, because not all kids want to room with their parents on a trip, right? But it is an option. But a big thing that I'm a big proponent of is like, if you do a solo room for a transgender expansive student, whoever, one, you need to make sure that like none of the other kids are like, they get their own room, that's so unfair, blah, blah, blah. I'd be like, well, that you have to shut down that language. And two, you need to make sure that the choir program pays for the difference. There should not be any kind of unequal financial obligation for a trans person because they are trans. So like, yeah, it might cost an extra $50, but you know what? Like the program will survive, and if there's like a financial issue, build that into the cost accordingly. So like when you do your rooms, or like when you have an overall overarching cost, charge a couple of dollars more per kid so that's looped in as well. That's something that really works. As for bathrooms, which is something that Andrea brought up, I agree with Josh, by the way, like that. It is something that I think is shocking that tour companies don't already do this. But like, until we say that it's a problem, they're not going to care, and until that problem starts costing them money, they're not going to care. So I think the first step is admitting that it's a problem, and then pushing them to make the change, and using tour companies that provide that extra information. But at the same time, like there's only so much that the tour company can do. At the end of the day, you as the director are kind of like the arbiter of these things. It's harder when you're going to another country, like straight up. International travel is its own entire beast. You have to get familiar with the country's laws, all of those things. And same honestly with America and states, like, because like it looks very different in California than in Texas, right? In terms of policies, in terms of laws. Like I'm shocked. I live in Chicago now and I'm from Texas, and the sheer difference is, it's mind-boggling, um in a good way. But your job is, like, as you are planning out your itinerary, is to be cognizant about, like, okay, bathroom options, what can I do? And of course, like, there are going to be emergencies that you don't plan for, and that, then you kind of have to navigate in the moment, right? But, like, as you go through, like, if you are doing a bus trip, which is what most of my choir trips were, like packing on a bus and drive across a state or two. The planning, like, where bathrooms are that were gender neutral, or making sure that they had family restrooms, calling ahead and saying, hey, this might be a strange question, but do you have a gender neutral bathroom or a family bathroom available? And that way you can kind of, like, plan these things into your stops, and try and make them in safe areas. A lot of times, if you're traveling in rural communities, if you're traveling in more conservative areas, those can be a little, more dangerous for trans or gender expansive people because of differing ideologies. It's something that you need to be sure of. And then also, like, when you actually get to your locations, right? We sort of already talked about this with, or Josh had mentioned with, like, the performing space, or like the cathedrals that you perform in, like, you have to have a plan for gender neutral dressing rooms, and or having an option for that. Like, where are your trans kids going to change? Where are your non-binary kids going to change? Do they have a place where they feel comfortable to do that? Because again, like, not only, no matter where you are, if you transition, if you don't transition, there's different feelings about your body. And then there's the internal thoughts about your body, and then there's, like, what are other people going to think about my body? And then as a trans person, it's like, people are going to see my body, they're going to judge my body, and my body is wrong. And those are things that, like, people don't really conceptualize, right? So it's like, when I'm changing with girl, or like when I was changing with girls before I started hormones, I was like, well, I have, like, a flatter chest, like, these are things that I had to think about. um and yeah, but ultimately what it really boils down to is checking to see how comfortable your choir members are. That's really, at the end of the day, like, because every trans person is different, because every gender expansive non-binary person is different, and they're going to have that different level of comfort, at the end of the day, include them in the process of decisions and saying, like, hey, this is what I'm thinking, or how would you feel about blah? A lot of times we don't get asked the question, we get told the answer, and I have a problem with that. So if you just go up to your student or your choir member or whoever privately, and you say, hey, we're doing this trip, we're going to do this, what do you feel about this? How are you feeling bathroom wise? Like, I want to make sure that you are comfortable, because I think a lot of times trans people or non-binary or gender expansive people elect to not go on a trip because there's so many hurdles, right? For whatever reason, they're so uncomfortable. And I think we all know that trips are really beneficial. They're fun. They're stressful for the director because you're like, I don't want to lose a person, especially in a foreign country. That's terrifying. But the being able to have that experience, like, I think about my choir trips all the time, and I think about them from, like, I treasure those moments. And for somebody to potentially miss out on that because of an aspect of themselves that they cannot control, that's not cool. So yeah, it really boils down to those kinds of things: is having a plan, doing the work and doing the research, and then checking in with your trans student along the way, or your gender expansive student, and making sure that there are options, and then backup plans and some of those things, so that you set yourself up for success and you set your choir member up for success.
Mhm. Wow, that's so much information, Melanie. Wow. A lot to digest. Here's a question I'll throw out to all three of you. When we start talking about making room assignments, and the first person, I concur, I think the first person you talk to is you approaching the student and saying, who would you feel comfortable rooming with? But then the second question has to be, what is our obligation to ask the other students in the room about having a trans or non-binary student in the room with them, and what obligation do we have to the parents, because we're dealing with children and youth choirs. So, yes, there's FERPA that we have to be mindful of, and yes, we have to be mindful of not outing people who are not ready to be outed or don't want to be. What suggestions do all three of you, because you're all coming with different perspectives, what thoughts do you have to offer about how to navigate that? You can all jump in at one time, or go for whoever wants to jump in first.
I mean, my first thought is that if you've thought through this and you have policy language around it that's really clear, that's in your handbook, that's something that is just part of the organization's culture, I think that is a better case scenario than sort of trying to grab at straws midstream.
But what do you mean by language? Like, what kind of language are you referring to?
I would make it really, I mean, if it was my organization, I would have policy language that says that that said very clearly, in very clear language, a combination of what Andrea and Melanie talked about, right? Which is that this is exactly how rooming assignments are made. This is our policy on, you see organizations that have policy language around honoring trans and gender expansive singers in things like honor choir auditions, right? Like in California Choral Directors Association, we have a statement, right? So I think you can make that really clear. I think it gets into really tricky territory of how are you going to have discussions with other students and other parents without outing someone that doesn't want to be outed, right? I think you're walking a really, really fine line there. So that's what I want to say.
Andrea, what do you think about this question?
I think that Josh brought up a really good point, and just setting up the clear expectations. I mean, am I naive in thinking that the kids know each other and they know who their friends are, and so I don't know that you need to. I mean, certainly you don't want to out anybody. So I think you're just treating everybody as a human being, not necessarily labeling somebody as this person is a trans person, this person is, a cisgender person, not even putting the labels on it, because the kids know, and just saying, who do you want to room with? And then, Mary, how do you feel about rooming with, XYZ person? And, the kids know each other. And I would think that kids know a lot more than the adults know even. So I don't think, I don't see it as a really big issue. But I understand that absolutely never wanting to out somebody. And so I think it's more the parents that, and maybe that is your question, because it's always the parents that are going to have more of the issue than the kids. So maybe Melanie has some tips for that.
Yeah, what I would, I think y'all are both right. It is a fine line, because in an ideal world, we want everybody to feel great, but with differing views, that's hard. When it comes to some of this stuff, I always err on the side of like the marginalized student. That's where I fall. But I think it's a combination of things. I think the stuff that Josh is talking about, and having clear language set up for your organization, for your choir, in your handbook, and I think Josh is putting something in the chat right now that's going to have some clear policy language, but there are ways of phrasing it, and there are ways of saying like, this, like, it's based on like students rooming is based on gender identity, or like, I don't know. There are ways to do it, and there are ways to phrase it. that are going to work. And Josh is trying to paste from the Cathedral School in San Francisco if it works, but if not, you can Google it. And but finding ways to, like, by default having a we support our transgender expansive students, that is unchanging. And then I think what Andrea was saying was smart, and just like, kids know who each other is, especially in a choir. Like, if they've been around that student before, they're going to know that person. And so instead of being like, Mary, do you want a room with Sarah, even though she's trans, like, just be like, hey, Mary, you want a room with Sarah? Oh, cool, great. And again, maybe your ideal room has 4 people in it, right? And maybe Sarah only feels comfortable with this one other person, and only feels comfortable with Mary. Okay, cool. Like, the 2 of them can do their own room, and then the program pays the difference. But like, even if you just do a room of like 1 other person, that can work. And then, again, like with other parents, like, if you have the language that says like trans people can room like based on their gender, I think that's helpful. And then if the parent complains, well, it's like, well, like, this is in our handbook, this is in our language, we already have this policy set up, and that's just part of being a member of the group. And if the parent wants to change it and throws a huge stink, you have to navigate that situation in the moment. Like, I can't sit here and say it's always going to be the right call to just say keep the kids in that room. Like, if there is a parent that is really like going nuclear, then maybe it's an easier fit to just move that child out of the room and do that. Would it suck, and would it be a little bit hurtful? Yes, but like, I'm not going to tell a student you can't go on the trip because we don't have anybody for you to room with. Worst case scenario, I'm going to say, hey, you want your own room? And maybe the kid's going to not be a fan of it because like they want to be with their friends, but it's better than them being in a place where they feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What you found there, Josh, is great. That's really, really helpful language. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, a couple of things. So speaking in generalities, and I think that most of us that work with kids would agree that they are so far beyond us on this conversation, and that a lot of what we like really fret about and make a big deal about, they're like, oh, can I share a sandwich with you? I mean, it's just like, so it's they speak about gender in a different way, and many of them think about gender in a different way. That's a generality. The other thing is I think it's really important that we think through, what is the implication of really scrutinizing where a trans or gender expansive child can sleep, right? I'm assuming that like when I used to take my middle school kids on tour, or my high school kids on tour, we had very clear expectations about like what's happening in these hotel rooms and what's not. And if you break these rules, if you break these school policies, you're going home, right? That applies to all children, period, regardless, right? So this heavy scrutinizing of like who can sleep in which bed there's like a really like there's kind of a sinister assumption baked into that line of questioning, that like because of your gender, you are going to behave badly in a hotel room, right? Most kids that are in choir just want to like go on tour, have fun with their friends, and have a pillow fight and then go to bed, right? Like kids, period, right? So I think we need to think about the gendered assumptions behind those questions, and also look really clearly at the law, right? Now that that gay, lesbian, and transgender people are a protected class under the new Supreme Court ruling, like you're also, you can also look at possible legal protections that those students.
I think the question that may come from a number of directors, though, is it's not the kids that are the problem, it's the parents. I see Troy waving his finger. And that is a whole different kettle of fish, right? So how do you may have a whole choir full of kids who are very accepting of one another and very progressive in their thinking about all of these things, but their parents might not be in that same boat with them. So thoughts about how to navigate that territory, because that is complex. And you're talking about parents who may decide, well, if that's the way they're going to be, I'm going to pull my kid out, and they will. There will be some parents who will do that, or they will make enough of a fuss that it can be highly destructive to the group. So thoughts, how do you navigate that? How do you, we wish that people wouldn't be that way, but they are. And as Troy's pointing out, he's in Arizona, and we're all in different parts of the country, and different parts of the country are going to respond differently as well. Melanie, you were saying what a difference it was being in Chicago compared to Texas, right? So how we may be legally bound to provide opportunities, but some parents might not really care, right?
It is just a sad reality. That's where we're at. And, I always said the same thing. I rarely had issues with kids. If I did, I could correct them pretty quick. And like the first year I came into a junior high, the tenor bass ensemble was consistently using gay as a slur. And, like, that's so gay. And I was very consistent in saying and shutting that language down. And by the end of it, like, we had a new person come into the class that second semester, and some new guy, and he called something gay, and one of the kids corrected him that had been using it the previous semester. So kids aren't really the problem. And if they are, you can usually fix that. When it comes to parents, I mean, it is such a contextual situation that I'm kind of with Josh, where it's like speaking in generalities is really, really difficult, right? What I think some parents want is to be heard, and to let them vent their frustration. And if you have, and I think that's part of the reason that policy language is so important, right? If you can point to that and just be like, well, hey, like, this is part of how the group operates, this is what we do. You can point to the law, and yeah, you're gonna have some parents who won't care. Some parents might pull their kid out, and that says more about the kid, or than the parent than the kid. And it says more about the parent than the program. Ideally, we don't want to lose students, right? Like, I worked in a 2C school where I had like 60 kids in choir. My varsity choir was like 23 people at its like biggest, right? And when one kid left the group, or it changed the entire sound, because that's just the nature of singing. So we don't want that to happen. And then of course a kid will miss out on the experience. But like, I would say, like, try and approach it with kindness and love, and assume the best intentions, even if the parent has the worst intentions. Try and have that, like, a good conversation, and try and make the parent feel heard. And then it's walking a tightrope. And I think you as the director have to kind of see, like, is this parent going to go nuclear? Is it going to damage my program? Is it going to damage a kid's reputation or a relationship? You have to kind of navigate that line based on the context. And there's only so much that we can do, like, speaking in that generality, because these situations get so nuanced, and everybody is so different in terms of their beliefs and in terms of whatever. Like, you could have a parent that's like, I really find this frustrating. And then you talk to them a little bit and they're like, oh, you know what? I can understand that. And maybe you'll talk them off the ledge. Maybe you won't. You just don't know. So, I mean, I think you let the parent feel heard. And then, if you can find a way to, like, move the kid and do it, and do it in a way where, like, the trans student doesn't feel like people are abandoning them because they're, like, again, like, there's emotional fallout to whatever decision that you make. It's just a matter of walking the tightrope and trying to be cognizant, and then being kind, and trying to make sure that the trans student and the marginalized student feels protected.
I very, very frequently remind people when there's problems that arise, what is in the best interest of the student. If you always are thinking of what your decisions are and how they are affecting the children in front of you, they're kids. They're kids. We're the grown-ups. We're supposed to be doing what is best for the kids. And so if I sometimes feel like it's a very selfish thing on the part of adults when they say, well, I think it should be XYZ, but what's best for the kids? Why that has to be always first. I just think that's really, really important. That may be very Pollyanna-ish maybe, but I think if people are reminded, what is in the best interest of all of these kids, not just one child, but all of these kids, what is the best thing for them? This is such a great discussion, and I'm so grateful for all of you for being here. We have like 5 minutes of our friends who are listening in here. Are there any of you who want to make a comment or have a question for our panelists, or would like to offer anything to this discussion? Please feel free to. We have a couple minutes here.
Well, you know me, I'm just going to jump right in.
I know, Troy.
Thank you guys so much for taking the time to do this. More than anything else, thank you for allowing an opportunity where we can talk openly and freely and continue to do the work that we need to do. Lord knows I by no means have many answers, but I have lots of questions, and I'm not afraid to keep asking because that's what my students deserve from me. And this is who we are and what we do. I think, Josh, I'm so echoing so much of this. I'm a policy guy. I'm very much a handbook guy. I believe that covers us in so many ways, but it also sets and tempers expectations. I would love to find more choirs and this is the challenge, right? We all say it's hard to speak in generalities. Well, then it's really hard to have policy. Because policy is quite the opposite of generalities. It's the hard and fast. It's the, and trying to find ways to have policy that is supportive of every kid. Because that's it. Kids want to sing. We want kids to sing. That shouldn't be so hard. And yet there's nuance. So anything we can do in terms of finding more and more policy examples, I think really help. I think one of the things we've been leaning toward with Phoenix Children's Chorus for next year, and I'll float it out there, and if somebody shoots me down, that's totally okay. I think where we're starting is identifying that gender is complex and ever changing, and that's okay, but that our rooming will be based on the gender that each family identifies in their registration, and that choristers will have the opportunity to select roommates through the process, because that's something we already implement. So hopefully, and we provide options where they can identify any way they want in terms of gender. So that gives us just it gives at least something a little more concrete, but not necessarily to beholden. So if you see a hole, poke it. I'm thrilled to, find the mistakes, but that's kind of where we're leaning towards, being able to find a way to have some policy language that at least supports that we're going to support the kid wherever they are. And if they registered as he, him last year, and this year it's she, her, and next semester it's they, them, okay, well, we'll keep figuring it out. But as long as the registration's there, we'll just keep changing it, and that's okay. So that's a lot. Sorry, there.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of really good things there. I think there's a lot, like the spirit of what you're saying is really wonderful. And I think that you're absolutely right in the idea of like speaking in generalities is hard, but policy is specific. You're right. And so I think having a broad sweeping policy in some instance of just saying like, we support the gender identity of our students, and that and when it comes, like maybe even when it comes to rooming, we consider the gender identity not assigned sex at birth. That's an option that would work, and it's enough where it's clear, but it's also like you don't have to pigeonhole yourself anywhere. I think when it comes to the the gender is complex and ever changing. I don't know about the ever changing part, sort of, you know, because I think we get really lost in this kind of like false narrative that trans people are living in a phase. And there are students who, you know, one year they're like, hey, like I had a student when I was teaching in Houston, and one year they said, hey, I use they them pronouns. I said, cool. They said, this is the name I use. I said, cool. And then they signed up the next year for choir. They weren't originally a choir kid, but all the trans kids flocked to me. And so I was like the trans Pied Piper. And the next year they came into my class and I said, hey, Avery. And they said, oh, that's not my name. And I go, oh, okay, cool. And they told me their pronouns. So I think it's just like, we're going to honor and respect, you know, somebody's gender, but maybe without, or the idea that gender is complex is great, but the ever changing aspect, like, yeah, like that's the only like part of that where I feel a little squishy about, where, you know, like for some people like that are navigating it, absolutely, but for others, like, that can contribute to like, well, this is just a phase, and then that contributes into like the misinformation that we saw in like Houston's bathroom campaign, where people were saying, well, like, oh, they're just going to decide that they're female to go into the women's restroom. So, you know, it's just one of those squishy, like, small word things, but it's something that, like, that's what I think about when I hear it.
Josh, I see you put in the chat there a couple of the one screenshot of the one policy, and you have reference here for some other policies. I can create a Google page resource that I can put a link on our Facebook page, our Children and Youth Facebook page. And if Josh, you can send me whatever stuff you have, and Melanie, if you have access to, I think people are really interested in policy language, especially that they can reference some good examples of that. I think that would be super helpful, that we can make available. I mean, I'd say we could just put it on the Facebook page, but then it's not collected in one place. And that way other people can contribute if we make it a community document. If other people come across language that they think works really, that they want to use as a policy, we can put it there and people can kind of reference it for their own ideas. Because I think that's, if you don't have a policy, you don't have anything to hang your hat on, really. You know, you don't have to anything you can go back to and say, and you don't have anything you can go back and point to and say, well, it says in our handbook, you know, we told you, you're responsible for reading it. If you didn't read it, that's on you. You know, there's some things there. So we are at our hour point. So I think we could probably talk for a lot longer, but I just want to thank all three of you for being here, and thank you for those of you who showed up today. And this is being recorded, so we will make it available through ACDA. I'm not sure how. I know that ACDA was super interested in this discussion, and perhaps we can make it one of our roundtable discussions as well at the national conference. We do have this roundtable forum time, and so maybe this can be one of the topics of the forum. Because I think it's a really interesting topic that a lot of people are really trying to figure out and sort out. I just want to thank you all very, very much for being here, and I guess we're going to have to wind it up. And I wish you all the best for the rest of January, and hope we can connect in Cincinnati at the conference. So. All right.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you.
night.
Thank you all. Thanks, Joy, for putting this together.
Absolutely. I'm going to stop the recording now. Here we go.